Hello, folks. I'm back with the lecture on the Industrial Revolution. As I said, some of this may overlap with the previous couple of lectures and the lecture on colonialism, but hopefully most of it will be new. So, for this lecture, there were two assigned readings. However, I'm only going to have you do one of them, the one by Eric Hobsbawm, and that's where this quote comes from. So, in talking about what the Industrial Revolution was, this kind of is one way to sum it up quite well. Hobsbawm calls it, quote, the first time in human history that the shackles were taken off the productive power of human societies, which henceforth became capable of the constant, rapid, and up to the present limitless multiplication of men, goods, and services. In other words, there had been kind of a limit to what people were able to produce by themselves and with the kind of economic systems that had existed. But with the Industrial Revolution, there were some social changes that had taken place, economic changes that had taken place, greater globalization and mechanization, which made the process of producing things much more efficient. So one person was no longer limited by, what they were capable of within a given time span. So with greater mechanization and efficiency, the same number of people could produce a lot more because a good portion of the labor was actually done by machines. So to break it down into some points that made the Industrial Revolution different from preceding eras, there were greater investments in technological improvements, and investments in those improvements could be offset by, the increase in revenue that those same improvements would bring, right? So if you can produce and sell more, you're getting more revenue, and so you can easily pay off those investments. Now, previously, it didn't make a whole lot of sense to invest in something like that because there was not the market there, or the ability to create a market that would really easily pay for such investments, right? So if most people are producing off of the land, and like in a feudal kind of system, farmers don't have a whole lot of incentive to try to produce more efficiently because they were only producing for themselves and whatever they had to give to their lords. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense to try to be innovative and find a way to produce more, really. And the same went for uh, anyone who may have been a manufacturer previously, because you were mostly producing for the home market, and you just weren't going to. There wasn't going to be a large enough market for an increase in output to equal the increase, to have an equal increase in demand. But in the process of this industrial revolution, what ended up happening was the products that were being made could be made so easily, so quickly, so cheaply that they actually produced a market for themselves. And according to Hobsbawm, that's initially how the market for automobiles took off. According to him, there wasn't really a strong demand for those. They seemed like kind of a luxury good. I mean, if you needed transport or you needed something to carry goods for you, there were horses. And not everybody really needed a car, especially if you were living in a like an urban kind of environment where your work might have been close by, everything you needed was close by. Why have a car? So according to Hobsbawm, it was actually like increases in the efficiency of producing automobiles that spurred the development of a market because it made them cheaper and more affordable to more people. And then once more people started to get automobiles, it was only a matter of time before infrastructure started to be geared towards automobiles. And so the demand grew, and it eventually sort of became almost a necessity. Another thing that was going on and had been going on for a while was increasing urbanization. So, whereas in the past, the vast majority of people would have been, in farmland, sort of agricultural populations, for some time there had been a growth in urbanization and the employment of more and more people in wage labor as opposed to kind of working the land for themselves and to pay rent. There was also a change in terms of who was driving the economy and economic policy. So the power of the merchant capitalists, these figures that loomed large in shipping industries, was declining, and the power of the new industrial capitalists, the manufacturers, was increasing. So when did this take place? According to Hobsbawm, the first real phase began in Britain, and it started around sometime in the 1780s. Again, historians can debate over like what was the actual beginning, and it's always hard to find like an exact moment. These things usually are a process, but he puts it sometime between around 1780 and 1840, beginning in Britain and then spreading to other parts of Western Europe and then further on from there, and of course, the United States. So how did this come to be, and why did this happen when it happened? It wasn't simply that people just started to invent things and decided to mechanize. Hobsbawm talks about there being necessary preconditions, both cultural and economic, that sort of laid the fertile groundwork for the Industrial Revolution to even make sense. And he says that these conditions were first met in Britain, which is why it was kind of the initial home of the Industrial Revolution. Now, I have a video that goes with this picture, and I'll post it separately. But one thing that occurred, and it occurred quite long before the Industrial Revolution, was the end of strict feudalism. And this, in Europe, seems to have happened perhaps the earliest in England and Britain. And in a feudal system, you have the king or the queen that owns all the land in the kingdom. And the king then parcels out large portions of that land to, big nobles or sort of very important lords. And those lords are called vassals to the king. The king is their overlord. And in exchange for that land that they own, they owe the king military service and support. And usually those large landowning lords would then parcel it out to smaller ones, who would parcel it out to smaller ones, who would parcel it out to serfs. So everybody in this situation is serving at the mercy of the person that's kind of ahead of them in this hierarchy. And it's all based on land and what land can produce. So the serfs, who are kind of at the bottom of this totem pole, as I mentioned before, would be given this land in exchange for tribute to be paid in the form of products or maybe taxes to the lord, and it would be paid up and so on, and eventually reach the king. And whatever they didn't owe to the person above them, they could sort of live off of. This ended, according to this video, for a variety of reasons. some of which have to do with the Black Death. The Black Death occurring in the 1300s. It killed a huge swath of the population, something like maybe like 1/3 of the population. And so that obviously cut down on the labor force, and those that remained were able to sort of bargain more to get better terms for renting the land that they were on. And they could move around, so there became some competition. There was a rise in wages. So there were a variety of factors. There was increasing use of currency, and more agriculture became part of a market system where you could sell your excess goods on the market. Another thing that had occurred in England, over a century before the Industrial Revolution, was the end of an absolute monarchy. So, previously and in other places in Europe, there was the divine right of kings. Kings and queens were seen as sort of emissaries of God, and their authority and their rule came directly from God, so couldn't really be questioned. But Charles I in England was actually executed. I believe this was after the English Civil War, where there was a battle between people who supported the strict sequence of the monarchy and inheritance of rule, but then there were the parliamentarians who thought that Parliament should have increasing power, and they wanted a different person in line for the throne, and they battled over it, and those parliamentarians won, and Charles I, who was supposed to have inherited the throne, was executed in 1649. And from that point on, Parliament had increasing powers. Now, Parliament wasn't exactly representatives of all the people like the serfs, but they were representatives of other interests, other landed people. And so, along with that, money came into politics more, which I'll get into in another slide. There was also increased urbanization going on. So there were these political actions called the Enclosure Acts, and they occurred, on and off from 1604 to 1914, but they were especially going on a lot during the time between 1760 and 1830. And what this was like within a domain of some kind of lord. You would have like fields that belonged to the lord, fields that were parceled out to people below that lord or to serfs. And you had hunting areas, but you also had these common pastures that could be used by anyone. And so serfs would use those to gather hay or to graze their flocks, or maybe do some garden, grow some gardening crops or something like that. So they would be able to sort of support and subsidize their own livelihood that way. So during these Enclosure Acts, those became privatized, and they were no longer public lands. So there was less and less land for serfs to live off of, and some of them decided that they just couldn't really hack it in the agricultural setting. It just didn't make economic sense anymore, so they would leave for urban areas to sell their labor for wages. And so that was occurring quite a bit during the period that we're interested in. As I said before, there was more of a profit motive in politics because, again, in England, you no longer necessarily have the divine right of kings. Parliament drove a lot of policy making, and so Parliament was quite responsive to wealthy interests, be those the interests of the sort of mercantile capitalists, but that eventually switched to the industrial capitalists during the Industrial Revolution. So, you have now a government infrastructure that is responsive to profit and to the economy in a way that it really hadn't been before. Before, it was a structure to simply maintain the power of the king and the nobility. And here, it became something that supported economic interests of all manner of wealthy and powerful people. And then, of course, you did have technology. Now, Hobsbawm says that the technology that really kicked off the Industrial Revolution had been around for quite some time. And in fact, England was not at the forefront of this. France was further along, maybe even some parts of Germany, but very little technological development and investment was really needed to kick off the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So steam engines had already been around for removing water from coal mines, but eventually they started to be sort of modified and used in manufacturing processes as well. Another thing that Britain had going for it was a near monopoly on a large market. So if you are going to be able to produce more efficiently, obviously you need a market that can buy your goods. And with the rise of colonialism, all of a sudden the market was expanding. So not only was there a market at home, but there was also a market in the colonies that was available to British goods. And due to what another author, Beckett, who you were also going to read, but I decided to leave that one out. He calls it war capitalism, because a lot of this was not originally based so much on competition in the marketplace as it was military competition and military monopolization, really. So forcing people to take your goods, preventing competition for goods. So the European colonial powers would be fighting amongst themselves for supremacy in a particular part of the world or in a particular marketplace. And, England had territories in the Americas, and they also, the British East India Company had India. So prior to colonialism, the Mughal Empire in what's now India was one of the kind of largest and most powerful in the world. And little by little, though, the British East India Company would have ports and settlements along the coasts. And although they were not directed by the monarchy, they were given free rein by the monarchy to wage war, to colonize, to presumably collect taxes, whatever they would need to produce. And so actually it was not initially the British Crown that colonized India. It was actually a multinational corporation based in England, the British East India Company. And, they started taking over more and more territories and, presumably using conflicts that may have existed among polities and kingdoms that were already there to aid them in taking over more and more land. And so they gained a monopoly on the market in India. Now, cotton played a huge role in all of this. We talked a bit about sugar last time and how sugar really was kind of the impetus behind a plantation system and, the initial kind of impetus for the slave trade. But cotton really, really made it take off. So previously, cotton various strains of cotton grew indigenously in different parts of the world. And various peoples had used cotton for a long time. In Europe, wool and linen was used more because cotton didn't really grow in most of the environments in Europe. Now, India had long made really valuable textiles called calicos that were traded by European merchants to other places as part of the spice trade, and had been used and traded by to wealthy, elites within Europe. But it wasn't something that the common person really could afford or had access to or had need of, right? Because they had wool and linen products. However, there was a time in which the woolen industry in Britain, which had been quite influential and powerful at one point, was able to persuade Parliament to put tariffs on cotton textiles, or blockades maybe even, coming into England. And that actually ended up helping the cotton industry because raw cotton could be imported into Britain, and there were sort of small textile industries that were trying to make copies of Indian calicos, and they weren't super successful at first, but they started trading those to some of the colonies, and eventually the colonial power of Britain sort of deindustrialized India. So India had produced all these cottons, and eventually they realized it would be more profitable if the cotton textiles were manufactured primarily in England, and the Indian subcontinent could be one of the markets for those cotton products. So that's essentially what happened, is they sort of shut down production of textiles in large swaths of India, and they produced them in England and in Britain. So this all accelerated with certain technologies, which I'll get into in a minute. But basically, these if you think back to the world systems theory model, where you have like a core and a periphery and a semi-periphery, the industrial power in Britain and also in the north of America, the north of the United States, that is, became sort of the core, and they would manufacture the final product, and then that final product would be traded for slaves and sold to the colonies. So the more colonies that Great Britain got, the bigger the market that they had, and also they could use slave labor, which was essentially free, to produce ever larger amounts of raw cotton. So it became this sort of self-perpetuating cycle. And not only would they trade finished textile products for slaves, they would also trade rum, which was again part of the whole sugar economy. So rum was a product that you could make out of sugarcane. So in effect, colonization and slavery reproduced colonization and slavery. So in the South, and I have a couple of videos to go along with this. In the South, originally, tobacco had been a bigger crop than cotton. Cotton was even more labor intensive to produce than tobacco. There were a lot of steps in the production of cotton thread and fibers, including picking out the seeds. So, cotton is a plant, and there are seeds embedded in that sort of cotton ball, but those would have to be picked out by hand, and that would take a long time. So, there wasn't very much that one person could produce in a day. However, the cotton gin was invented, and that changed everything. And the cotton gin was a simple mechanism to remove the seeds from the cotton, and it sort of increased productivity maybe about 50-fold. So prior to the cotton gin, cotton wasn't a huge industry in the South. There was some cotton, presumably, but tobacco was more important, and the tobacco market wasn't doing so well at one point. And so there was a thought that, maybe slavery isn't economically efficient, and there was talk of possible abolition. And then the cotton gin came about, and that restructured everything, because all of a sudden it became economically efficient to grow and produce cotton threads, and to sell them to the North, and to sell them to Great Britain. And so more and more of the land in the South was devoted to cotton, because the environment was actually quite good for growing cotton in the South. And at some point, the South made up 70-some% of all cotton that was raw cotton that was produced, and then manufactured into textiles and sold throughout the world. So the cotton gin played a huge part in this. There's another video that I'm going to post about the transatlantic slave trade and how it was different in so many ways from other forms of slavery, because slavery has existed in many societies, if not most societies, for a long time in human history, but it was of a different character. It wasn't the kind of multi-generational slavery where people were just treated as property. There were a lot of forms of slavery where it was for either a limited time, or slaves could become part of the families of the people who owned them, or for whom they worked. Or they could buy their way out of slavery. Whereas in the transatlantic slave trade, slaves were viewed not as people but as property. And once sold into slavery, they were in slavery, their children would be in slavery, their grandchildren would be in slavery. And this video, it's only a 5-minute video, but it does like a really good job of talking about all the repercussions of this, not only among descendants of slaves, but within Africa, and for sort of international politico-economic relations between like Europe and the Americas and Africa. Because, initially European traders would trade weapons and rum and other goods for slaves, and the African kingdoms along the coast didn't think too much of it, because slaves were viewed in Africa as either criminals or prisoners of war, and the type of slavery that they had was not nearly as brutal as the type of chattel slavery that was part of the transatlantic slave trade. So they would use these weapons, to increase their power and to fight against other rival kingdoms. And then, eventually, because the demand for slaves was increasing, there would be competition between kingdoms, and there would be war, not only because of that competition, but war to prevent slave raids, and war specifically to get slaves. So it kind of increased tensions, and maybe even created tensions where there hadn't existed tensions before. And it created this arms race where, in order to outcompete neighboring kingdoms, you would need more weapons, and to get these weapons from the Europeans, you would need to provide slaves. And then the slave trade itself was abolished in the early 1800s, believe it or not. So even in the United States, there was an act passed in 1807 that went into effect January 1st, I think, in 1808, to outlaw the importation of slaves from Africa. However, the institution of slavery, as we know, was not abolished until really the end of the Civil War. So there was when the slave trade started to collapse, it left African kingdoms kind of scrambling because they had sort of retooled their economy around the slave trade, and so now they're left kind of destitute without that foundation of their economy, and with these internal intentions and rivalries that were created by the slave trade, and so that sort of perpetuated itself. So industrialization is not only responsible for widespread consumerism and commerce and all of the kind of luxuries and conveniences that we think of today and increased globalization, but along with it, it also really encouraged the slave trade, and all of this together laid the foundation for a lot of issues that we're still dealing with today. So the point here is to kind of go over why things happened the way they did at the time they did in the place that they did, and to show that the world that we were born into is a world that was created in the centuries past through these series of events that didn't necessarily have to happen the way that they happened, but they did because of a number of factors that came together. So it just helps to kind of turn the light on our society to show how we got to the place we did, and sort of the whys and hows behind the occurrence of that. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. The next one will be on colonialism, and there will be a study guide up for exam 2 shortly. I will see you all soon, or hear from you soon, or you'll see me soon. Okay, I'll talk to you later. Take care.